be loved by you, just you, nobody else but you. I wanna be loved by you alone. Boop-boop-ba-doo.
And devoted his life to public service. When the war broke out, he had a very prestigious job. He was a state senator, New York State senator. When the war came, he quit his job to go and fight in France. So let's talk about the war and the impact of the millionaires. Let's go back to the summer of 1914. The summer of 1914 was the Indian summer of the Gilded Age. That summer, wealthy Americans toured the continent, met their wealthy European friends in spas and ballrooms and palaces. None of them could see that just over a darkening horizon loomed a terrible storm that was about to break on them. A terrible world war that cost 16 million lives in just 4 years. 16 million lives. On June 28th, 1914, the Poughkeepsie Courier reported that Ogden Mills, the man who lived at Statsburg, had just bought himself a nice 120-room house in Paris. 120 rooms, 6 acres, right in the heart of the city. That same day, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was assassinated in Sarajevo. It was the spark that lit the fuse, and the war broke out shortly thereafter. British statesman Edmund Grey, looking out over that dark horizon as the storm broke, famously said, "The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime." You see, he saw that it was the end of something. It was the end of the Gilded Age. Now, in the Gilded Age, that period of history from about the end of the American Civil War in 1865 to about the beginning of the World War in 1914, the world's attention was captured by the explosive growth of new industries and by the fabulous wealth that the owners of those new industries had. People whose names we still use as synonyms for vast wealth. Banking, think J.P. Morgan. Steel, think Andrew Carnegie. Oil, think John D. Rockefeller. Transportation, think Cornelius Vanderbilt. You know, names we still use as a synonym for filthy rich. Oh, that guy's rich, but he's no Rockefeller. Or now probably you say he's no Bill Gates. How rich were they? Well, scholars think that John D. Rockefeller, the wealthiest man of the Gilded Age, was, all things being equal, money being equal over time, was probably the richest man who ever lived from the beginning of time to today. In today's dollars, at the height of his fortune, he had 6 times the money that Bill Gates had at the height of his fortune. He could buy and sell Bill Gates 6 times over. And the world's attention was also captured by the utterly frivolous ways that some of the millionaires wasted their money. When our neighbor, John Jacob Astor, decided he needed a yacht to go up and down the Hudson, he built the biggest yacht ever seen. He could take it up and down the Hudson or across the Pacific. He could sail around the whole world with it. It was so big, he loaned it to the Navy as a warship. When Alva Vanderbilt decided she'd like a summer cottage by the sea, that's the result. Marble House in Newport, maybe some of you have been? Yeah. That cost $11 million before the turn of the century. Not in today's money, in that day's money. $11 million, 500,000 cubic feet of marble. And when she decided that she wanted a yacht, she built a bigger one than John Jacob Astor. The millionaires threw themselves incredibly lavish costume balls. Some of these balls cost $100,000 and more. Now, the public ate it up. They were the celebrities in, like the movie stars in the days just before there were actual movie stars. You know, their comings and goings, their marriages, and eventually their divorces Well, it was front page newspaper story. This is a newspaper story about a party held at Stanford White's house. Stanford White was Ruth Mill's architect. Then the war came, and the world's attention shifted. Who cared about the millionaires wasting their money when the war came? You go from this to Germany declares war on Russia. First shots are fired. France is mobilizing and may be drawn in tomorrow. Plans to rescue the 100,000 Americans now in Europe. Given a world devastated by war, who cared how the millionaires wasted their money? The war also brought a perfect storm of social change. Changes that one by one nailed the nails into the coffin of the Gilded Age and ushered in a new era. Changes like income tax. That had an impact on the millionaires. Changes like new opportunities for women. Opportunities never before dreamt of. Came during the war years. And even new inventions, labor-saving devices that meant you didn't need to have a mansion full of servants anymore. The machine was going to do it. Let's go into the mansion now, and we'll take a look at how the war impacted the Millses. When you come to tour the mansion, you walk in the front door, and the first thing you see is Ruth Mill's grand entrance hall. She's putting on the dog here. She wants to impress her guests. She wants them to think that she's an American aristocrat. So what do you see? All the signature elements that you'd see in a European aristocrat's country home. There's the grand staircase, and you notice the Belgian tapestry there from the 1600s, like you'd have hanging in a castle. All that beautiful oak. And on the opposite wall, the photographer's here, and on the opposite wall, behind the photographer, are Ruth's ancestral portraits. She's competing with other Gilded Age hostesses to prove that she's the best candidate to be the next queen. The house is her argument. She's saying, I'm a Livingston, living in my ancestral home. My family goes back to the 1600s. Oh, and by the way, I've got a lot of money. Look at all this lavish stuff. I've got the money. I've got the family heritage. I'm the best candidate to be the next queen of society. The Americans are locked in an increasingly silly competition. Now, the Europeans don't have to compete. In England, you know who the next queen is, right? The next queen is the person who's married to the Prince of Wales. You know that the Duke is above the Viscount, and the Viscount's above the Earl, who is above the Knight. They don't have to compete. Oh, but the Americans do. And they get into this silly competition of out-snubbing each other, and outspending each other, and out-dining each other. But when the war comes, I think it's very different. Do you want to be an aristocrat in 1917 in Russia, where they murdered the royal family and killed aristocrats by the thousands? And also, I think, in that main hallway, when you came in as a guest, I think the conversation changed during the war years. You'd walk into that main hallway, you'd mingle, and what were the conversations like? You might say, Ogden, I hear you've got a horse entered in the Grand Prix. Best of luck with that. But during the war years, when you walk in that main hall, the first thing you notice are there a lot of people missing. The young men aren't there. They're off serving the war. The conversation changes. Instead of, Ogden, how'd your horse do in the Grand Prix? It might be, Ogden, what do you hear from your son in France? I hope he's safe. Ogden, I understand your son-in-law is involved in that terrible fighting in the Balkans. I pray for him. I think the millionaires become less frivolous and much more serious. Well, at the mansion, you'd mingle, and then you'd be shown upstairs to change for dinner. Dinner's the main event. That's why you're there. And when we take the tours upstairs, you see these beautiful bedrooms in the mansion. And also when we go upstairs, there's an etching hanging on the wall of this gentleman, President Roosevelt. His daughter Alice was good friends with the Millses' twin daughters, Beatrice and Gladys. And Alice used to come and stay at Statsburg. She was there when Teddy was elected president, and the Statsburg band came and did a little serenade for her. Well, there's an etching of Teddy in the hallway, and it has a curious thing on it. It's got 4 tiny little flags at the bottom. And I see in the back of the etching it was done during the war. I think those 4 flags refer to the fact that he had 4 sons in service during the war. You know how in World War II you get a flag to hang in your window if you had somebody in service. And these little tiny flags look a little similar to me. The war was not good to the Roosevelts. Teddy's son Quentin was killed in the war. His son Archie was terribly wounded. Ted Jr. was gassed. And his son Kermit served the entire war. He joined the British and fought with the British before the Americans even got into the war. And then he joined the Americans. Teddy Roosevelt never got over Quentin's death and died himself just 6 months later. That strong bull moose died at the age of 60, grieving for his son. Now also, when you're upstairs at the mansion, we show a reproduction of a maid's room so that people can see how the maids live at Statsburg. And we don't have any photographs of the actual maids, but I love this photograph. It's just our period. It's just what you would have seen at the mansion. Come the war years, people who are working in service suddenly have options. A lot of people left service and went into nursing. Maids can become nurses, and maybe they don't come back. You know that World War I song, how you're going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris, right? You know, the farmers' sons went off to Europe and they saw Paris, and then are they going to come back and keep plowing? No, maybe they want greater and better things. Well, when people who were servants went off in war industries, maybe they never came back. Now, when the guests change for dinner, we go down and we see the dining room. The Mills' fabulous dining room. Here it is decorated for Christmas. We don't always decorate it like that. We can't keep that up all the time. It's always very nice, but for Christmas we try to pull out all the stops. But the Millses would decorate like that all the time. Now, I'm not saying that Ogden Livingston Mills, their son, I don't mean to imply for a minute that because he was a rich guy, his sacrifice was any greater than anybody else's. But you know, when I'm at Statsburg, I can't help but make the comparison to what he was used to and then what people were experiencing in France. You know, of course you still had dinner in France. You know, a little different. You know, the Millses threw lavish dinner parties. Well, of course, in the trenches, you still had guests come to dinner. But they were different, yeah. The trenches were overrun with rats. You go on the internet, and it's filled with these pictures of rats from the trenches. You know, here's the German soldiers. You see the French soldiers and the American soldiers all doing stuff like that. You're still having guests for dinner. There's a great World War I story that takes place in this astonishing dining room. This is the Breakers in Newport, and perhaps some of you have been to the Breakers. It was the home of Alice Vanderbilt, Mrs. Cornelius Vanderbilt. She was famous for the perfection of her dinner parties. In the summer of 1914, before the war broke out, she invited a special guest. This is what the millionaires like to do. I'm going to entice you to come. I'm going to invite a celebrity. Well, the German ambassador was in Newport, Count Bergstorff. And this is before the war breaks out. So she invites Count Bergstorff for dinner and sends out invitations to a big dinner party. Now, in between the time that the invitations went out and the party happened, the war started. Count Bergstorff is not going to cancel. He's the German ambassador. He can't have it implied that Germany has done anything wrong. So it's going to be business as usual. He's going to come to dinner. Mrs. Vanderbilt is concerned that people might have heightened feelings now that England and France and other European countries in 1914 are at war with Germany. She telephones all her guests and she says, don't talk about the war. Put yourself in their place. I mean, can you imagine us if a world war started and you go to a party the next week, we wouldn't talk about it? But these millionaires, they're used to soothing over the social bumps in the road. So it goes well. Everybody comes to dinner. Nobody talks about the war. They mingle, they change, they come into dinner, everything's going well. The first course comes in, the soup, polite chatter going on. And then a curious thing happened. The second course didn't appear. Mrs. Vanderbilt, you got it. You know where we're going. Mrs. Vanderbilt's famous for the perfection of her dinner parties. She rings the bell for the servants. No one comes. She rings the bell again. No one comes. Imagine the guests now, right? Trying to keep up the polite conversation. Finally, a blushing chambermaid came in and handed Mrs. Vanderbilt a note. Well, you see, she thought about her guests. She telephoned all her guests, concerned about their feelings, and said, don't talk about the war. She didn't think about her staff. And her kitchen staff, to a man, was French, Belgian, and English. This is what the note said that the chambermaid handed to Mrs. Cornelius Vanderbilt. We, the undersigned, regret to inform you, madam, that we cannot any longer serve the enemy of our respective countries. We have thrown the rest of the dinner into the dustbin, and we have all left your service. There is nothing else to eat in the house. We hope you all enjoyed the soup, for we took good care to spit well into it, every one of us, before it went to the table. The next day, Count Bergsdorff left Newport. And poor Mrs. Vanderbilt, she lost her son the next year on the Lusitania when it was torpedoed by a German submarine. Now, just off the dining room is almost a hidden room. It's Ruth Mill's private room. It's her boudoir. And it's another room where she's putting on the dog, where she's trying to imitate what you would see in Europe. Here's the boudoir. I wish I had a lighter picture. Beautiful white and just filled with gilding. The walls are gilded, picture frames are gilded, even the furniture is gilded. And here's a hint about her influence. That's a picture from the Tsar's summer palace in Russia. You can kind of see where Ruth was going. And don't think for a moment that Russia was too far away to be in the Gilded Age millionaire's orbit. Oh no, it wasn't. Here's the Tsar and his first cousin, King George. Anybody know who's who? Any guesses?
George is on the left.
I think it's Nicholas on the left with the widow's peak. Well, how can you tell? Where is it? Where? Oh, I started to go back. I was going to go back to that family picture, but I think it's too far back. I puzzled over this for a long time, and then decided that the Tsar had the little widow's peak. They were first cousins. Their mothers were sisters. Now, the Gilded Age millionaires knew Russia. Sissy Patterson was a very wealthy Chicago heiress. Her uncle was ambassador to Russia, and she wrote about going to Russia in the years just before the war. She met the Tsar. She was at a reception where she met the Tsar and the Tsarina. She said the Tsar was just an ordinary-looking man, but she was struck by the faraway look in the Tsarina's eyes. And when she met the Tsarina, she noticed the Tsarina's hand was trembling. And she thought, she's as nervous as I am. And she has this delightful detail about the balls in the palaces in Russia. She said the Russians had to wear their full dress uniforms, which included spurs. The ladies are in these beautiful gowns from Worth and Worth in Paris, and they're being shredded as they dance by the men's furs. And the ladies would steal off to the corners to try to sew their hems back up. Here's the Tsarina and two of her daughters. They volunteered as nurses during the war, but it didn't save them from their terrible fate. Serge Obolonsky, and anybody correct me if I'm pronouncing his name wrong, if you know Serge Obolonsky. He was a Russian nobleman. There was a price on his head. He escaped Russia after being in hiding for some time. The Bolsheviks killed his cousin. They thought it was him. And the heat lifted, and he was able to come to the States. He came to Rhinebeck, and he married an Astor. And he stayed at Stadsburg, at Mill's Mansion. Now, imagine him going to Stadsburg. And what kind of stories does he have to tell these would-be aristocrats about what it's really like to be an aristocrat in the middle of a revolution? You know, his first wife didn't call the Tsar Your Majesty. She called the Tsar Uncle Nicky. And his cousin was Felix Yusupov, who assassinated Rasputin, the mad monk who had such a baleful influence on the Tsarina. Now, when I first started to do the tour, one of the first times I did it, I mentioned Serge Obolonsky, and a guy on the tour did a double take. And he said to me, I used to service Obolonsky's cars in Rhinebeck. He said he had a Jag and a green 54 Plymouth. Our local celebrity from the Russian Revolution.
Plymouth?
A Plymouth. Believe me, that struck me. He's got a Jag and a what? My reaction exactly. They knew the Tsar. They traveled in Europe, all over. People like Ogden Livingston Mills, by the time he went to war as a young man, he had traveled in Europe extensively. He had friends everywhere, in all the countries in Europe. In 1917, he knew exactly what he was getting into. Many of the best young men in Europe were already dead by 1917. These Americans going over knew what they were getting into. Sissy Patterson, the woman who wrote about meeting the Tsar, her mother wrote about meeting the Kaiser. She said, he was a bumptious youth and I did not like him. Now, after dinner, the ladies withdraw from the dining room. They withdraw to the withdrawing room, the drawing room. And there they converse while the gentlemen are back in the dining room smoking the cigars and talking brandy. Once the women leave, then the men are free to talk about business and politics, which would not be polite over dinner. Then the ladies go to the drawing room. Any Downton Abbey fans here? A couple of people have watched Downton Abbey. You see this in Downton Abbey, right, where the ladies get up and they withdraw. Now, in the Gilded Age, the ladies might be restricted to polite conversation. Gilded Age mores would say, well, ladies aren't supposed to discuss politics. Perhaps you'll discuss debutantes and dressmakers. But how can you do that during the war? Another Gilded Age memoir talked about, in the drawing room, someone mentioned the effects of being gassed. The person said that the soldiers sometimes recover, or seem to recover, and then die months later. And another woman in the drawing room fainted. Her son had just been gassed. And tragically, he did die a few months later. Remember how I said in the main hall that you'd walk in and a big difference would be that the young men were gone? I think it's the same in the drawing room. The women are gone. Gilded Age millionaires go off to volunteer in France as nurses. And it's not without risk, not at all. Edith Cavell was a British nurse. She was with the British Army when it was overrun by the Germans in Belgium. She stayed behind to care for the British wounded. The Germans arrested her. They accused her of helping wounded British servicemen escape, and they shot her. Yeah. This domineering figure in the middle, that's Anne Harriman Vanderbilt, Mrs. Willie K. Vanderbilt, Willie K was Fred Vanderbilt's, our neighbor, Fred Vanderbilt. Willie K was his brother. Oh, and by the way, Anne Vanderbilt, she's Ogden Livingston Mills' mother-in-law. The Mills' son, mother-in-law. Are you getting all? There's going to be a quiz. It makes your head spin, doesn't it? Well, you can see, she's organizing this big Red Cross meeting. Ogden Mills' sister was a nurse in Paris. Ogden Mills' daughter Beatrice was a nurse in Paris. They brought their wallets. When they saw a need, they addressed it. Ogden Mills' sister saw stretcher bearers struggling to get up the stairs with wounded men on stretchers. She paid to put an elevator in the hospital. Mr. and Mrs. Willie K. Vanderbilt funded the American volunteers. Before America got into the war, there were American volunteers who drove ambulances. Like our neighbor, Mr. Suckley from Wilderstein. I think it's Henry. Does anybody know?
Henry.
Yeah. And I think he didn't survive the war. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the Vanderbilts are paying for the ambulance corps. Now, suppose you want to hire a volunteer ambulance driver. What qualities are you going to look for in the interview? What do you need to be a volunteer ambulance driver in World War I? Well, you need plenty of daring and courage. They're going out under fire to pick up the wounded. You need quick reflexes driving these primitive machines, and of course you need some mechanical ability because these primitive machines are going to break down on the battlefield. These are the same qualities you need if you were going to hire a fighter pilot. And the ambulance corps, the American Ambulance Corps, became the recruiting ground for the Lafayette Escadrille, the volunteer Americans who fought for the French Air Force before America joined the war. Here's Alva Vanderbilt. You remember Alva built Marble House, built a bigger yacht than John Jacob Astor? She was one of Ruth's rivals to be Queen of Society. I want to read you a great quote from Alva Vanderbilt. She said, "I know of no profession, art, or trade that women are working in today as taxing in mental resources as being a leader in society." Now think of that. A woman like Alva Vanderbilt or Ruth Mills, they're powerful, dynamic, well-educated, wealthy, energetic women, and they have this tiny, meaningless playing field. Society, silly parties. But the war changed it. And Alva Vanderbilt became a suffragette. She organized the very first picketing of the White House in support of women getting the vote. And poor President Wilson had been opposed to getting the vote. But after a little bit of this, he sang a different tune and he supported women getting the vote as a war measure. And the 19th Amendment was finally passed in late summer of 1920. Ruth Mills didn't live to see it. She died in April of 1920. Now, the gentlemen eventually leave the dining room. They come and join the ladies. Everybody gets up and they go together to the library. The gentlemen are finished talking business. What do you think they're talking about during the war years when they talk about business? Somebody said how they can make money. Excuse me, Justice. Well, they're also talking about how they're losing money. Because what happens in 1913? Permanent American income tax. Inheritance tax during the war years. I bet that was a popular subject at Statsburg. The British went from having an inheritance tax, I think it was something like 15%. They rose it up between 50 and 60% to pay for the war. These young fellows inherit the estate, they can't pay the inheritance tax. And I just read that the head of Clan Fraser, and I'm going to look to Michael for support here if he's heard this. Young head of Clan Fraser inherited the ancient family home. He couldn't pay the inheritance tax and he sold it off. Son of a gun! They didn't call me. You know, I would have thrown in a couple of bucks. That's the kind of thing they're talking about. Henry Ford in 1914 is paying his guys on the assembly line $5 a day. Well, there's another revolution. After 100 years of the Industrial Revolution, there's finally, the workers are climbing into the middle class. Just as the rich people are losing their money, people are creating the middle class. That's some of the stuff that they're talking about in business. Now, when they come to the library, they don't come to read. They come to play cards. And in the shadows there above the fireplace, you can see, oh, that's a bad picture. It's Morgan Lewis, Ruth Mill's great-grandfather. He built the first Statsburg. He fought in the Revolutionary War. The painting is a copy of a painting by John Trumbull of him in his Revolutionary War uniform. He became a general in the War of 1812 and third governor of New York. Ogden Livingston Mills, the young Mills' son, grows up with this in the library, a military tradition. General John Pershing, Blackjack Pershing, the head of the American Expeditionary Force, well, when he went to France, he needed headquarters. He wanted headquarters in Paris. Ogden Mills loaned him that 120-room mansion. Remember that? I mentioned at the beginning, he just bought 100. He can't use it, you know? So he loaned it to General Pershing. And if you come to the mansion now, you can see a beautiful sterling silver tray where Pershing engraved his thanks to the Millses and presented the tray as a token of his thanks. Now, after the guests play cards in the library, Ruth Mills goes to her fabulous bedroom where she retires for the night. And I think during the war years, I think it's a restless sleep. I think her dreams are buffeted by the winds of change that are sweeping her world away. Poor Ruth. Ruth has grown up with an idea of propriety. It's one of the foundations of her life that women have to behave in a certain way. Well, as if suffrage were not bad enough, family legend is that Ruth Mills banned yellow flowers from the house. Yellow flowers were the symbol of the suffrages. Ruth Mills was apparently so opposed to suffrage that the head gardener was told not to bring yellow flowers into the house. And perhaps, while Ruth is in the bedroom, it might be an opportunity to mention that the first works on contraception were published around 1914. And also, around that same era, the tea gown was introduced. Now, the idea of the tea gown was it's kind of informal afternoon wear for the rich millionaires. And the thing with the tea gown is the rich ladies can put it on by themselves without the maid. And you don't have to wear a corset under it. In 1914, they introduced something called the brassiere. Now, if you can put it on without the maid, you can take it off without the maid. And in Ruth Mills' circle, marriage infidelity was all the rage. The fashion came that you would entertain afternoon callers for tea. And as long as everybody was discreet, all the Gilded Age millionaires were okay with that. Not Ruth and Ogden. We think they were really in love. No hanky-panky. But all this is happening to Ruth's world. And I don't think she's sleeping well. Look at those big rings under her eyes. And then, what engine of change comes to bedevil young people's morality? That thing that preachers called sin on wheels. The automobile. And who's driving it? Now, when Ruth Mills was young, a young fella comes to call, and he's going to have tea in the parlor with the young lady. Well, the parents scrutinize. But now, come the automobile, the young man arrives in an automobile, and he expects to take the young lady away on something called a date, without a chaperone. And how long is it before the young ladies start to drive? And they can take themselves out. It's an independence previously undreamt of. And, where do they go? They might go to a roadhouse. You see it in Downton Abbey. In the later episodes, one of the young ladies of the family, Rose, goes out to meet other people who are not rich like her, and she likes them. What other invention comes along that shakes everything up? The humble typewriter. What's the humble typewriter do? Why, it creates the world of paperwork. And businesses need people to type. Women go get those jobs. And don't you see that in Downton Abbey too? It's one of the first episodes. One of the ladies at the house helps the young maid. The maid's got to smuggle in the typewriter so nobody sees her practice it. Then she goes away and she never comes back to service. This gets women into businesses at the bottom of the bottom rung, the bottommost rung. But they're in. And generations later, their great-great-granddaughters maybe are the CEOs of those businesses. But it's starting with women getting in just below the ground floor. You remember the maids, maybe they went off to be nurses. Nursing wasn't the only job you could have during World War I. These men went off to factories. Women took their jobs. Yeah, after the war, the women got kicked out. But their daughters were Rosie the Riveter. Their daughters went back to work in the factory. And their great-granddaughters, again, maybe the great-granddaughters of the CEO. Scores of British women were killed in munition factory explosions. Women risked their lives and gave their lives in industry during the war. All the farmers have gone off. You've got to feed the world. People become farmers. Downton Abbey fans, Lady Edith was driving a tractor, as you'll recall. And remember those young men, those ambulance drivers with the quick reflexes? Well, they're not all young men. You could even get a job as a spy, like Mata Hari did. Didn't go well for her. She was arrested by the French and shot. Yeah. Now, another social phenomenon happens connected with all these war industries during the war years. It's called the Great Migration. Impoverished black sharecroppers in the South come to take those industrial jobs. Factories are booming. The war industries makes them boom more, and now lots of people go off to the war. People who have been living in poverty since slavery come north and take those jobs and take the first steps towards getting in the middle class. The army is still segregated, but doesn't it weaken the argument of segregation when men risk their lives? How can you argue that they shouldn't have equal rights? It's a long argument. The army wasn't integrated until the Korean War, but here are the pioneers. Now, there's yet another revolution that changes Ruth Mill's world. Here's another machine that changes it. Oh, the washing machine. The vacuum cleaner. Do you need a house full of servants once you start having machines? Well, surely that's the lady of the house, right? Where's the maid? She doesn't need a maid. I can't find a good high-resolution picture of this that you could see better. But she's saying to the grinning husband, I don't mind housekeeping a bit. Well, she's got her vacuum cleaner, and she's got her washing machine, and her electric griddle, there's her electric iron, so that by 1920, the kitchen doesn't look that different from our modern kitchens, right? Look at that electric icebox she's got. Oh, and what's that behind the alarm clock there? Right? The great-granddaddy of the cell phone. We'd have to explain it to the kids what that was, right? Well, with all these changes, with the millionaires' lavish spending no longer in fashion, or at least publicizing it, no longer in fashion, with the income tax, the inheritance tax, with all these social changes, what happens to many of the Gilded Age millionaires? You know, they built these vast mansions imitating European royalty. They thought they were going to last like the European ones, generation after generation, hundreds of years. We don't do that in America, do we? No. They built these vast mansions, and they were gone in a generation. The children never lived in them. They were torn down, gone. 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 That's a lot of people's favorite candidate for what inspired The Great Gatsby's house, what inspired Fitzgerald's description of The Great Gatsby's house. It's on the Gold Coast in Long Island. One generation. And of course, our local candidate, correct me again, Wildercliff, right? Mrs. Jones' house. Yeah. All gone. It makes me more grateful than ever to have Statsburg still intact. Well, Ruth Mills died in 1920. Now, I'm not saying that all these changes killed her, but maybe for Ruth's sake, maybe it was just as well that she didn't live to see the woman of the 20s. The woman of the 20s, she smokes, she drives an automobile, she drinks, she bobs her hair, she goes out and gets a job. The woman of the 20s bobs her hair, smokes, drives an automobile, goes out and gets a job. And above all else, she votes. She was the flapper. And as Louis plays us out, I'll thank you all for your kind attention, and I'd be glad to answer any questions. Well, I've exhausted every possible topic. Please.
I think when the income tax started, it was very, very low, wasn't it?
I don't know. I dare say you're right. I don't know. I think what I read, which I didn't know, was that there had been an income tax at certain times before, but there was never a permanent income tax until 1913. That's as much as I know.
By World War II, I was at like 90%. That lasted quite a while.
Yeah, yeah. Yes, please.
Which person is it that's down in St. James Cemetery? Is it Ogden Mills or?
I think the whole family is there, from Morgan Lewis, who died in the 1800s. Ruth and Ogden are there. Ogden Livingston Mills is there. I don't think his is marked. They're awfully private people. St. James, what an extraordinary place. The first time I walked around, especially being involved with local history, I couldn't believe my eyes. There's so many famous people there. Quite a place. Yes, please.
Was Ruth's bedroom the model for Astor's Titanic suite?
Well, funny you should mention that, because I make that argument when I do a Titanic tour. Every spring we do Titanic tours at the mansion, and I also do that as a talk. But I make the argument that I can't bring you to tour the Titanic, but I can show you what first class on the Titanic looked like by walking around Mills Mansion with Titanic photos, and you would be amazed how room after room after room at the mansion has its equivalent on the Titanic. And when we get to Ruth Mills' unbelievable, fabulous bedroom, I tell people this is what the White Star Line had to compete with. John Jacob Astor is used to living in rooms like this. John Jacob Astor was paying something like, I'm rusty on my Titanic figures. Was it? Well, I won't quote it. He was paying a king's ransom for a one-way trip across. But that's the argument that I make, that the White Star Line was going after the money. They weren't going after speed. They were going after the John Jacob Astors, the Ruth and Ogden Mills. Ruth and Ogden had tickets for the Titanic. They had tickets for the second trip, which it never made. So I do make that. I say, what you see in the mansion, that's what the White Star Line had to compete with. It's almost like a plant, If I could have paid you to ask a question, I would have paid you to ask that one. Any other questions? Please.
I was an elementary school teacher in Rhinebeck, and we took a trip down to Mills, and the docent was saying that Mrs. Mills did not talk about her wonderful things that she had as a millionaire. And one of the boys in my class said, no, all you had to do was look around.
Yeah, excellent point. You know, Chancellor Livingston comes every year, and they do, third grade comes every year, and they do a Titanic program with us. Yeah, we do about 1,000 kids a year at the mansion. I'm so proud of that. I'm so pleased. You know, that's the next generation of historic preservationists. And let's get them out into our historic sites, because they're going to be the taxpayers. Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you all so very much. I'll stay around for a few minutes. Because of my cold, I'll keep my distance, but I'll be very happy to answer other questions. Thank you so much.
I wanna be loved by you, just you, nobody else but you. I wanna be loved by